Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and today we're going to do something a little bit different. A topic that we covered last year, but I wasn't really happy with that video, so I wanted to go into much greater detail and hopefully things seem a little bit more clear now. I'm of course talking about the possibility of Total War Warhammer 40,000. So without further ado, let's begin. Total War Warhammer 3's release is this year, which not only means that we're hitting the third and final game of the series, but also the team behind the fantasy titles at Creative Assembly will obviously need to look towards a new title to work on. Now of course, before anything, it goes without saying that we should not expect another fantasy title for at least a few good years, mainly because of two reasons. 1. Total War Warhammer 3's lifespan is likely to be a few good years. The second game in the trilogy has lasted for quite some time due to the fact that there is, 40 good years worth of lore and possible content? With cross-game DLC likely to be much more prominent in Game 3 than it was in Game 2. That really extends the possible lifespan of it and allows for the DLC to work on more and more content. 2, and most importantly, well, we need some more historical titles. Warhammer Fantasy through Total War Warhammer had the most attention in recent years, which as a Warhammer Fantasy fan myself is fantastic, yes. But I too am a Total War fan. Rome Total War was my first ever title, and I have played near enough every other title since. They've not received much love over the last few years as Creative Assembly have been experimenting with titles, but now, obviously post Warhammer 3's release, it is time to go back to what made them who they are. I'm not sure as to what the next historical title can be, but all I know is we need a new one. Now, with all that being said, it's likely that Creative Assembly have felt the recent rise of popularity with their first dive into something other than historical games, and I said before, they will likely look towards the next one. Fantasy Total Wars were always wildly requested, and it was proven that even Warhammer Fantasy, taking into account here that Warhammer Fantasy has been officially dead for quite some time, was a huge success. The issue, of course, is that some other fantasy licenses are notoriously difficult to get your hands on. The Tolkien estate is the perfect example of this, as there have been issues regarding games in this setting. Of course, Creative Assembly could be talking to these estates very much in advance, it does make sense from a business perspective, but why go to a different company to acquire a license when they already have a healthy and long-standing relationship with Games Workshop, the creators of the extremely popular Warhammer franchise? 5 years or so into the known public relationship, and still a few more to go with Total War Warhammer 3 round the corner, it's proven to be a very lucrative partnership as Warhammer Fantasy essentially dominated the Warhammer video game world. Obviously, Warhammer Fantasy is not the only setting Games Workshop created, there are a few which are quite popular. Age of Sigmar, the high fantasy setting, Warhammer 30,000, which is essentially a huge civil war, and lastly, the most popular of them all, Warhammer 40k. I don't believe there's much need of an explanation as to what this is, as many of us would be familiar with the 40k universe in one way, shape or form. Age of Sigmar, while possible and a fast-growing fantasy setting, still needs a good few years if both Creative Assembly or Games Workshop would like to see a Total War game based in the setting, as the universe itself is still very young and needs to be fleshed out properly. I'm not saying it won't happen, but rather it should not happen just yet. Warhammer 30k, as stated before, is based around a massive civil war, and while the lore itself is indeed interesting, it is centered around Space Marines, loyalist against traitor, so there isn't really much to go through there. Not many possible races could be implemented. Warhammer 40,000 on the other hand has a large variety of different races, on an absolutely massive setting which is not focused around a single planet, but a whole galaxy. Thousands of different planets, each with their own biomes, different varied races with their own deep lore spanning hundreds of novels, and not only that, but it is a currently supported universe. Now, we'll get into the gameplay aspects soon enough, don't worry, but first let's look towards the point as to why this could be possible. Total War Warhammer will eventually run out of possible content to release as DLC. Both Creative Assembly and Games Workshop have benefited greatly from this trilogy, though perhaps CA more than GW. Warhammer video games were always promoted by Games Workshop as a way to market the miniatures themselves. This is very well known when it comes to the pure slog of releases that have happened over the years. The games that do well introduce many people to a new setting, and in turn make them interested in buying the miniatures. This was very obvious with games such as the early Dawn of War series and the much-loved Space Marine game. Many people were introduced into the hobby just because of these games. Total War Warhammer had that too, where despite the fact that the setting of Warhammer Fantasy was considered long dead in an officially supported format, many people wanted to buy the miniatures. It got to the point where Games Workshop had added a new search term on their website, where even searching Total War Warhammer on the Games Workshop official website would link you to all the models that were associated with the game. As I said, all Warhammer games act as marketing for the miniatures, and it doesn't need to attract everyone to buy the minis, but if it gets a number of them, then it's a bigger profit for Games Workshop. Of course, they are still getting their commission for any Warhammer games that are produced and sold, but people purchasing the miniatures will provide a much larger profit margin, we can be sure of that. It's likely Games Workshop didn't have much hope for Total War Warhammer. Keep in mind this was during a period where the license for Games Workshop-based video games was quite easy to acquire. It's also a reason as to why we had such a bloat of badly made games from mostly indie developers, but let's not dwell on that and keep on topic. With Warhammer Fantasy being unsupported, it was easy to think that the game itself might not even sell very well, especially since CA had until this point only focused on historically focused products. But it sold, and it sold very well. Since the trilogy was announced, things blew up. Speculation exploded as to who, what, and where would be included. The first game sold loads of copies, and even more so as DLC, and the second game was eventually released, with a third one on the way very soon. Profit for both parties, of course, is expected to be very high, but for Games Workshop there is a potential problem. Well, not a problem, but something they may not have anticipated. Total War Warhammer may not sell that many models. While yes, it did sell models, and that was very obvious as a content creator, as I've heard many of my subscribers tell me that they got into the tabletop games through Total War Warhammer, a reoccurring topic does often creep up, and that is that they were looking for Warhammer Fantasy. They wanted miniatures of the units and the characters that they had been playing for hundreds if not thousands of hours. Attachment by association of course, but Warhammer Fantasy had been shelved a while ago. Age of Sigmar or 40k have of course been alternatives, but again that's not what some people wanted. It's hard to sell a product when you're looking for another one, isn't it? So why Total War Warhammer 40k? Why could this be the next Total War fantasy game? Well, first off, yes, I am completely aware that 40k is a sci-fi setting, not fantasy, but I am referring to it as fantasy as it is likely that the fantasy team in CA would likely be the team behind this possible project, so we'll refer to it as that as to avoid any possible future confusion. Well, as stated before, Total War Warhammer 3 will likely be running for a while. It can be assumed that since it is the last game of the trilogy, that they will try milk it for everything that it's worth, and of course this does make sense. DLC, race packs, cross-game DLC between all three titles, there are many possible options. The DLC team could easily work on this while the main fantasy team works on its newest title. I do not expect for a new Total War fantasy game to be released anytime soon. Firstly, again, they need to milk Warhammer and not distract from it from a fantasy aspect. It really makes no sense to have two active fantasy games both trying to fight for the limelight. And secondly, we need the return of true historical games, a few good years of nothing but what originally made Total War what it is prior to the inclusion of Warhammer. The return of medieval, Rome, Empire and so on is drastically needed, and in truth it is expected. But what about in a few years' time, 2026 perhaps? The Total War Warhammer series has so far seen around 5 years of a lifespan between two games. And it is expected that Game 3 will allow for a few more, possibly even longer. Creative Assembly and Games Workshop saw how well Warhammer did, with CA taking the biggest risk of them all. Why not take another risk at a possible slight push from Games Workshop and try sci-fi? Warhammer 40,000 is by far the largest setting that Games Workshop has. Many people have heard of Warhammer 40k due to its rapidly growing popularity in recent years, and it honestly shows no possible signs of slowing down. If both Games Workshop and Creative Assembly could manage to pull this off, it could make serious money, more so than any of the other games in the Total War series. The amount of time between Warhammer 3 and a possible Total War Warhammer 40k would be long enough to deep dive and come up with new mechanics, systems and everything else needed to create a pure sci-fi setting in Total War. If they managed to do so with fantasy, why can't they do it again? When you really think about it, the basics for what could be a Total War Warhammer 40k could essentially already be here. Magic would draw similarities from the fantasy games already in place, as it's already the same universe by technicality. The lore is very loose here, but this would fit with the Psyker system put into place for Warhammer 40,000, as it is essentially the same thing with a different name. Each of the possible races and factions would draw from their respective codex, also known as army books, to get spells implemented, but again it would be very similar or a reskinned clone of that of the Total War Warhammer magic system. Basic implementation of tanks has already been theoretically added in with the implementation of the steam tank, which is pretty much the same basic framework in a sense. The only difference, of course, would be making the tank turret being able to rotate to fire. Mechanically, we know this is possible, as we have many units who can fire at a 360-degree arc. Just visually, this is not yet possible to the best of my knowledge. Of course, this would have to be expanded upon even further with hovering tanks and the like, but we've already started to see floating characters such as Ariel, so again the system is already in place. Flying vehicles would presumably use the same implemented mechanics with the flying creatures already in place. Of course, slightly more static when in the air, but we've already seen the implementation of static flyers via mods such as the Lothern Skycutter, so the technology is already there if modders are able to do so. Shooting, of course, would need work, as obviously this is Warhammer 40,000, where shooting is very common. We have a fluid sort of mechanic, but it would need to be sped up to increase rate of fire. That being said, with regards to any high rate of fire weapons, the implementation of stuff like the Skaven Rattling Guns and Jezzails already work mechanically very well, which is what is expected from a lot of guns in the 40k universe. Obviously, everything mentioned above would require new animations, but then again, with new races, factions and so on, it would be expected that new animations would have to be put into place anyway. Gameplay would naturally of course change, but again, it has already changed drastically with Total War Warhammer, and bridges into what could be very loosely 40k. The biggest issue would be the campaign itself, with the game focus on one planet, similar to that of Warhammer Gladius. But then again, isn't that a bit too small if DLC is to be milked? A similar system to Dawn of War Soulstorm, where a system of planets could be played, again possibly too small. The idea I personally have would work in an almost similar way as to Total War Warhammer and indeed all other Total Wars right now. A campaign map representing a part of the galaxy itself, where all the towns and cities and so on would in turn act as their own planets. A group of planets, around 5 or so, would form part of a complete system, where full control would get you the bonuses that you would normally get for controlling a full province. The campaign map in itself would act as space, where you could travel freely from planet to planet, moving as you should normally in any other Total War. Let's use Reichland as a basic example here. There are 4 settlements in that area, where that would act as its own complete system. Each of the settlements would be their own planets, and between them is nothing but space. However, you'd be able to move your armies through transport ships to go to the other planets. Now, of course, what does this mean if you meet another army in open space? Creative Assembly have seemingly shied away from naval combat in all its forms as of late, so the system put into place for island battles in Total War Warhammer would work incredibly well. Armies meet in open space, but would fight on an abandoned planet or asteroid, maybe with different biomes, just relating to whatever star system they would currently be at. Something like that would work rather well and wouldn't need to complicate things with space naval battles. I don't know what we would actually call them. Though I do wish that we would get something like this in a potential Total War Warhammer 40k. However, if we're not getting it in fantasy and we're not getting them in recent historicals, I doubt that we'll get them in 40k too. Instead, flyers would likely be implemented as their own units, as you can use them as such on the tabletop. There would also be sharing of assets, animations, and so on with certain races. Demons of Chaos are the perfect example of this, as not much really changes between the setting, though it could be assumed that more demons might be released in the 40k setting by the time a Total War Warhammer 40k does come into effect, if it ever does. Now, before anything, I'm sure that there are some people who are thinking regarding unit sizes and so on. The game itself does not have to follow the baseline Warhammer 40,000, but rather Warhammer Apocalypse, which is much more of a grand scale of the game system in terms of army sizes. Of course, Space Marines would have a smaller unit size than say Imperial Guard, but not too small where your squads are 5 Marines or so, but rather 20, maybe even a bit more given the Apocalypse standing. The possible starting races would be very obvious, 2 good guys and 2 bad guys. Well, this is 40k, the lines are very morally grey in that case. Some examples would be the Space Marines, as they are the usual trope here, as of course they are the poster boys for the setting. You can't look at anything 40k related without getting slapped in the face by an Ultramarine. Eldar are also an obvious choice. Despite never really getting much love in terms of new models, they've always been fairly popular. Chaos Space Marines seem like a good choice too, as they are also popular and would share many animations with generic Space Marines. Finally, Orcs, because well, it's Orcs, who doesn't love them? The 40k setting makes them absolutely mad, as pretty much duct tape and belief makes their flyers work. Also remember, red makes them go faster for some reason or another. Regarding demons, well, unless something drastically changes for them, given as they currently haven't had that many new models from Warhammer Fantasy to Warhammer 40k, they could easily be the pre-order race, as the assets could be ported from one game to another. The possibility for DLC is also really large, more than likely more than Total War Warhammer, as there are many different Space Marine chapters, many different Eldar craft worlds and so on, which all act differently and could even have their own unique units. Think about it this way, with the Space Marines start off with the Firstborns and start moving on to the Primaris, eventually start introducing different Primarchs and different units, factions and so on as they get introduced into the tabletop. Which is why I'd say that maybe a game like this would be best served for around 2026. As that would more or less be the time that we could expect Warhammer 40,000 to move from 9th edition to 10th edition. New editions mean new models, new armies, new factions, reimaginations of different things already in place. It just would work extremely well to be able to cross-promote. I think something like this could indeed be possible. Of course, as I said, historical first after the release of Total War Warhammer 3. But this could be an interesting way for Creative Assembly to break out into a new style of setting. We know that Total War Warhammer 40k has already been wildly requested. I honestly think that Creative Assembly will try to at least flirt with the idea. But what do you guys think about all this? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a bit of a discussion. But with that, my friends, we've come to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like, or even subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us out. In the description section below are various links to different social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Discord. Also in the description section is an affiliate link with Element Games where you could buy loads of hobby-based products, not just Warhammer, for 10 to 25% off. Making a purchase using that link and also our special code, which is also in the description, supports the channel at no extra cost to you, which we think is rather cool. A big thank you to our patrons. Your support means the world to us. It's amazing that people want to help a small channel like us grow and get to a higher level of content. A big thank you to Gibraltar LUSC, Ryan Bertsche, Andrew Prince, and Okro for subscribing to us at our Fane level. You guys are super cool. And a big thank you to Edward Yule, VS Vasan, Aaron Whitman, and Shaggy for subscribing to us at our King level. Honestly, we can't thank you all enough. And lastly, a big thank you to all of you for liking, sharing, and commenting on these videos. Honestly, it's because of you guys that the channel has been growing at such a great pace lately, so we can't thank you all enough. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching once again, and we shall see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.